Welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Krista Morton. We are with Microbalance Health today talking about mold illness and connections to disordered eating. Just as a foundation for today's conversation, this is not medical advice. This is for educational purposes only. And we are talking about a sensitive topic. So I do want to just put it out there that if you do have a diagnosed eating disorder or you think that you have one, you should absolutely be supported by a qualified clinician. But we hope that today is going to bring you more understanding into what's going on, potentially the underlying factors, and replace blame with self-compassion. That is really the catalyst for all types of healing, but especially the focus for today. So if you've ever felt like your body is fighting you, or food feels like a battleground rather than nourishment, this conversation is for you. Eating disorders are extremely prevalent. Nearly 1 in 10 Americans will experience an eating disorder at some point in their lives. And then anorexia nervosa, this is the eating disorder with severe food restriction, caloric restriction, typically, and it involves this malnourishment component. It actually carries the highest mortality rate of any mental illness. So that highlights how serious this eating disorder is. And then beyond diagnosed eating disorders, we have the category of disordered eating or emotional eating, which it counts for about 30% of people that report emotional or disordered eating with food. And we've all experienced this at one point or another, right? Emotional eating component of food. And food is supposed to be serving us in different ways. It's supposed to be more than nourishment. It's supposed to be connection. It's supposed to be celebration. When the problem comes into play is when we start to only have a one-track mind about how food serves us in our life, and then we don't allow it to serve the other ways that it was supposed to, right? We only look at it from a lens of nourishment, or we only look at it from a lens of pleasure. We actually need to integrate all of those together. And so understanding that disordered eating doesn't always fit neatly into a diagnosis of anorexia or bulimia, mixed eating disorder, or orthorexia. We're going to talk about a few of those today, but this can simply look like irregular eating, food noise in the background constantly going on. You're constantly thinking about it, but maybe your behavior doesn't fit in the category of an eating disorder. Could be rigid rules around food, which this one's a really sneaky one for those of you healing from chronic conditions, because rigidity in your nutritional patterns can be covered up by you managing symptoms, right? Which is a real thing. And we're going to talk about how to integrate and reintroduce foods and have a healthier relationship. Primarily where I want to camp out today is the aspect of control around food to manage and cope with the stress of chronic illness, mainly mold toxicity, mycotoxin illness, and conditions that are related to that. 70% of individuals with eating disorders also experience some sort of mood disorder. So think anxiety, depression. And that tells us something really important, that the population with chronic illness is vulnerable to using food as a coping mechanism, right? If you're chronically ill, you're feeling chronically stressed out, your brain is constantly getting it's on alert, right? It's kind of doing this scan of danger around you. And if you have mold illness, your brain is inflamed all the time. And so it's constantly getting that danger signal, and it's constantly looking for a way to self-soothe. And so it makes sense that food would be one of these ways to self-soothe. There's often also a feeling of being out of control in your body when you are chronically ill. And then, like I mentioned before, long-term restrictive or therapeutic diets like antihistamine diet, carnivore, keto, paleo, some of these things can turn into more of an obsession, or they can turn more of this disordered relationship with food rather than just an objective symptom management. So that environment is kind of setting the stage, so to speak, for disordered eating to express itself. And this isn't a failure. This is really a coping response. And there's a lot of, there tends to be a lot of shame and negative talk or self-esteem when it comes to disordered eating. Some folks who experience that feel like they need to punish their bodies for not healing the way that they want it to, or just the only means of pleasure that they have amongst a mess of symptoms. Okay. So it's not about blame. Today's not about blame. It's about understanding why the patterns develop in the first place and exploring what is the body actually asking for and what's it doing as you're leaning towards these tendencies of disordered eating. Understanding that it's not a willpower problem, it's actually a nervous system problem. And we're going to talk about two pathways that lead to this and how mold plays a role. So we've got two common pathways to disordered eating or eating disorders. Number one is a biochemical imbalance. This is seen in literature that talks about, anxiety and depression, neuroinflammation, and how the biochemistry is set up for those types of conditions. That mood disorder presentation creates a vulnerability to disordered eating, right? Going back to that 70% comorbidity of disordered eating and another mood disorder. And then an emotional stressor that requires a coping mechanism, AKA chronic illness in the context of this conversation. So the biochemical and the somatoemotional repercussions of mycotoxin-related illness are consistent with both of these pathways, the biochemical and the emotional, that can lead to disordered eating patterns. And the common system amongst these pathways is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. We were just laughing backstage about this because I was saying people might be tired of hearing me talk about your sinuses and your pituitary gland, but we're going to talk about it again because it is such a central point of focus in the conversation of mycotoxin-related illness that we have to discuss it, because your sinuses are really the gateway to mold overtaking and hijacking the health of your brain, the health of your hormones, the health of really your whole body, because it enters that way. And then what happens is you breathe in these mold spores. And maybe you're like, yeah, I was exposed to mold at one time or another. I'm not living it anymore. Or I left a job where I knew it was moldy, or I sold a car I knew it was moldy. If you haven't had targeted sinus care and you've not made sure that the colonies are out of your sinuses or any fungal overgrowth in there, you could still be dealing with symptoms from that mold exposure due to mycotoxins, which are the microscopic mold metabolites. Okay. And so these sit in your frontal sinuses. And so they actually will release these vapors. The mycotoxins will release toxic vapors. And there's only a very thin barrier between your sinuses and your pituitary gland being that master hormone conductor in your body. Eventually, over time, the mycotoxins will actually erode that thin barrier. And there are severe cases of this. I know that Microbalance targets a lot of these cases where there's erosion of that barrier or there's calcification of the pituitary gland. Those are more severe cases, but understanding that this is a primary pathway to neuroinflammation and the brain being on fire in cases of mold-related illness. So that neuroinflammation ultimately can impact the blood-brain barrier. That's your protective layer around the brain, much like the lining of your gut is that protective lining around your gut. And the pituitary is sitting here acting as this master hormone conductor. And so you've got an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary controls stress hormones like cortisol and endorphins, right? Your catecholamines, those release of those stress hormones. The posterior pituitary releases hormones that support your nervous system regulation and connection, and releases things like oxytocin and vasopressin, and creates the conditions for dopamine to be released and uptaken. So when mold disrupts pituitary signaling, we often see this setup of too much cortisol and not enough oxytocin or dopamine. These are your feel-good hormones, right? It's your reward pathways. It's your feeling of love with oxytocin, right? This creates a chronic stress state, which reduces the feelings of safety, pleasure, and connection, which is typically, if you have been on a roller coaster of disordered or emotional eating for a while, when you have safety, pleasure, and connection in your life, those symptoms tend to come out a little bit less, right? And so that's where we also coin the term stress eating. When we have more stress going on in our life, we tend to not feel as safe. We tend to not feel as connected, okay? So then we also have to talk about the midbrain. This is where dopamine is produced. So dopamine works closely with oxytocin is essential for reward, for motivation, for pleasure. And when mycotoxins drive up oxidative stress, dopamine may be either released at lower amounts or not effectively received by cells. Not effectively received by cells is going to be the common denominator with things like dopamine resistance and leptin resistance, which we're going to talk about later, and how that interacts and contributes to disordered eating. So the oxidative stress, you have a lipid bilayer around your cells, and that lipid bilayer is supposed to breathe, letting nutrients in, hearing your hormones, hearing all of the things that are supposed to connect to the cell receptor, and letting toxins out. If that cell wall is burdened with oxidative stress, it's not breathing as well, and it's not going to be able to hear your nutrition and your hormone signaling. It's going to be impaired. And so the result of that is an impaired reward signaling. Your cells aren't hearing the dopamine that's being released. And so that can often lead to compulsive types of behavior, anxiety, depression, etc. And so food restriction or control can become a substitute source of dopamine within what we are painting a picture for, which is the mesolimbic reward system. Okay. So again, food restriction, both of these things, either overconsumption or underconsumption or some sort of rigidity or rule around food, can be due to this need for control that hits your dopamine pathway because you're not receiving or uptaking enough of it. Okay, so it's like a pseudo dopamine hit. And so what can look like disordered eating behavior is your brain seeking regulation and safety. It's not actually seeking deprivation or overindulgence or weight loss, right? And so that takes us to this deeper understanding of the mesolimbic reward system. This is your mood regulator. This is your, kind of your celebratory and reward system. It is comprised of key areas of the limbic brain. This is going to include the hippocampus, which is predominantly in charge of memory and learning. It's going to involve the amygdala, which is a huge part of your threat and emotional processing. And then your nucleus accumbens, which has to do with reward and motivation. Okay, so the mesolimbic reward system, it governs dopamine, which drives pleasure, motivation, and reinforcement, right? When we get a dopamine hit on something, it motivates our brain to do that again. That's one of the reasons that social media is so easy to slip into and constantly get a dopamine hit, right? And so in both anorexia and bulimia, those two most common eating disorders, the reward system becomes dysregulated, but it expresses in a different way. Much like when, two people could be exposed to the same strain of mold, they might have some crossover symptoms, but they're going to have two different, potentially unique clinical presentations from the same toxin. Same thing here. We've got this dysregulation of the reward system. Somebody might lean into control and get a dopamine hit from restriction, while another person may get a dopamine hit and activate that reward system due to overconsumption or binging, right? So in bulimia, emotional eating or food addiction, that food itself is strongly activating that reward pathway. And so that's going to lead to the repeated eating in pursuit of dopamine, often beyond what is necessary for us. And then, like I said, in anorexia, the reward system is also hyper aroused, but the dopamine reward comes from restriction and control, not from the food itself. So different behaviors, but the same underlying reward circuitry. This is also really important because there is kind of this loop that happens. It's sort of like a compensatory cycle. Sorry for the noise. Let me close that. Where there's typically some sort of restriction. And if you were to kind of go into disordered eating psychology, you would see that the pattern usually always starts with some sort of restriction. Now, from my point of view, from an integrative medicine standpoint, I don't necessarily always see that as restriction of food. One example of this could be, a restriction around what types of food you're eating, or a food allergy or sensitivity that develops, and then it kind of feeds this fear. But it also can be restriction of dopamine and pleasure, right? So it's a restriction from the reward pathway, then turns into this restrict, binge, guilt, restrict, binge, guilt, right? It kind of goes on this endless cycle. And this is where we do see a lot of mixed patterns. And I especially think that is true of those who have experienced disordered eating in the chronic illness community, just because of some of the underlying biochemical processes that are happening underneath in your brain and your gastrointestinal system. So before we get into some of that with the gastrointestinal system, I want to talk about another piece that has a lot to do with a presentation of binge eating or emotional eating. And this is the concept of leptin resistance. Leptin and ghrelin, right? Leptin is your body's satiety hormone. Ghrelin tells your body, I'm hungry, I need some food. Leptin communicates with the mesolimbic reward system to say, I've had enough or I'm satisfied. In a healthy system, the leptin turns off that reward drive once your nutritional needs are met. Mycotoxins interfere with this signaling. Same process as the oxidative stress and not being able to hear the dopamine. Your cell can't uptake the leptin and it becomes leptin resistant. It can't hear it, meaning that the leptin is present, but the brain and your cells can't hear the message. And so the oxidative stress that's occurring, especially in the hippocampus and on in the cell memories, it impairs leptin receptor sensitivity. And so that can look like persistent hunger, continued eating for emotional satisfaction, or confusion around fullness cues. This was definitely something that I had a personal battle with during my throes of mycotoxin illness and Lyme disease and all of those things. The feeling is sometimes that you're physically full, but your brain is not, it's not computing that you've had enough, right? It's kind of looking for this next thing. And part of the reason I think as well is because food can end up being one of your only sources of pleasure. If you are really sick, right? You can have a lot of symptoms. And then if you're not getting adequate connection through your relationships, you're a little bit isolated. Maybe you're a work from home. Maybe you live far away from your family, or you're just feeling isolated because not many people are getting what you're going through. Food can sometimes feel like it's the only thing there for you. And I want to acknowledge that because I don't think that's said a lot. And for those of you who are struggling with binge eating, emotional eating, you might have some sort of feeling about that, some sort of shame feeling about that. I just want to wipe that off of the table because you're going through a lot. And so it makes a lot of sense that the continued need for emotional satisfaction persists long after you've had enough calories in one sitting. Okay. So in restrictive patterns like anorexia, coming back to this leptin idea, leptin signaling is further disrupted and the reward system shifts towards the dopamine release associated with control, okay? So mycotoxins also create very commonly nausea and appetite suppression. That's usually related to liver and gallbladder stress, but I do see a lot of restriction occur around, honestly, just the symptoms, right? You wake up, maybe you're somebody who wakes up with nausea, your blood sugar's on a roller coaster, your liver gallbladder is really congested, maybe you have a little bit of acid reflux because your bile is flowing back into your stomach, and it doesn't really create the conditions of you to want to eat. Okay. And then if you are going through a long period of time between your meals and you're having this blood sugar dysregulation, that can create this sort of nausea, food avoidance, aspect as well. Okay. So long time going between your meals, your blood sugar might be thrown off. Mycotoxins increases your insulin resistance as well. So your blood sugar is already set up to be kind of on a roller coaster. So letting it dip too much, that can create nausea, especially in the morning for people. And so in both of these conditions, both of these presentations, we're not seeing a lack of willpower. Again, just dragging that point home. It's a miscommunication between hormones, brain chemistry, and your survival circuitry. Different eating behaviors can show up, but they often stem from the same dysregulated reward and satiety systems. And mold can be a powerful driver of that disruption of those reward and satiety systems. And so I do want to talk briefly about orthorexia. This is actually a newer diagnosis in the last couple of years. Was officially coined as a diagnosis in eating disorder. And so orthorexia it's hypervigilance around what foods that one is eating. And most commonly it's seen in hypervigilance around healthy eating. Okay. So this could be, I only eat organic. And if I don't eat organic, or I have to eat some conventional produce, you're just going to totally shut the system down. Or it can be, I'm only going to eat protein, or I'm only going to eat, paleo and no grains, right? And so it's good while you're healing to use food as medicine, okay? Like that is mostly how it starts, is using the food as medicine. What we have to keep an eye on is when it becomes a compulsion, right? And so I understand for a lot of you, especially those of you with mold illness that are dealing with mast cell activation, histamine intolerance, that one food could set you off for the whole day. And so of course there's naturally going to be some fear around new types of food, reintroducing foods or eating things that you don't know that are safe for you. It's when we get into this gray area where the restriction and the therapeutic diet is now more stressful than your symptoms, and you may be able to expand your repertoire, your nutritional repertoire, but you're too afraid to aggravate your body. Okay, so then it becomes kind of like you're stuck here. There's a lot of fear. It's no longer empowerment and therapeutic. It's restriction, it's fear. And so we do have to address that in a very nuanced way, because I don't want you to flare yourself up, right? And just go, eat a bag of chocolate and have a histamine flush, right? We're not trying to do that, but we are trying to kind of do this gentle reintroduction one at a time while retraining the brain that it's safe, it's good, it's beneficial to have a wide variety of foods. Diet variation is one of the best things that we could do for our metabolism, right? So going through seasons, that's why it's called therapeutic diets. And so there is some gray area there that definitely check in with yourself and see if you need any support as you're doing reintroductions on the mental emotional side of things, and make sure that healthy eating isn't becoming a compulsion. Okay, so we are kind of summarizing some of these here. I do want to get to the mental impact of chronic illness, because this is a lot of the piece of the puzzle too, beyond some of the biochemical shifts that we've talked about. So in addition to those biochemical pathways that we talked about, there is a massive mental and emotional impact of chronic illness, right? So very commonly related to mold illness, we've got conditions like chronic inflammatory response syndrome, mast cell activation. These create ongoing physical stress in the body. They impact multiple systems. If you've got one of those, or you've had one of those before, it can be all encompassing. And so this is really stressful. Like I said before, your brain is constantly screening for a threat. And if you've got some kind of neuroinflammatory toxin, your brain is constantly in a fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, and it's going to respond appropriately. And so when we look at that as well, we also have to understand that the brain isn't just creating this eating disorder or creating this anxiety or this food fear. It's responding to a very real threat. And then this is the behavior that is the compensation tool. So there's that aspect of just the stress of your symptoms itself. And then there's the fact that mycotoxin illness is very poorly understood and dismissed in conventional medicine. So for a wide variety of folks in the chronic illness community, it has taken you 5 to 10 years to get a proper diagnosis. You've maybe been to 4 or more doctors. And unfortunately, by the time you get a proper diagnosis, you've probably been dealing with this for a really long time. And so of course you have to cope somehow with your unexplained mystery symptoms. And so that sets us up for this picture of frustration, self-doubt, dismissal, not feeling believed or understood. And so there's that deep isolation that we were talking about before. And this relates to some of our biochemistry setup, because with isolation, you are experiencing decreased oxytocin at some point, right? We're wired for connection. And that hormone is associated with safety and bonding. So then in this isolation, whether it's binging or restricting, that coping mechanism can emerge as this means of dopamine and oxytocin again. So coping with the emotional toll. Okay. These behaviors offer a sense of control. They can feel like temporary relief. And there can be this feeling of empowerment when your health feels unpredictable, knowing that you predictably will eat at these times or this set of food, or if you're struggling with overeating, that in your private moment, you're going to grab whatever comfort food is calling to you, and you're going to have that moment of connection with yourself. And so at the bottom line, the nervous system isn't really craving food or restriction. It's craving connection. It's craving validation. It's craving safety, to be seen, heard, known, loved, and understood, right? All of our basic human needs. So because of this, outsourcing support could be the right path for you. This might mean therapy. This might mean community. From an integrative lens, we're dealing with a lot of these underlying, root causes, in this conversation being mycotoxins. And so we want to make sure that, I think one really difficult aspect of a combined case presentation of mycotoxin illness and anorexia or bulimia or orthorexia is that the standard eating disorder treatment is that you have to eat all of these different foods. That might flare your symptoms up, and it's this vicious cycle. So having somebody to work with that is actually knowledgeable in a little bit of the psychology aspect of disordered eating, as well as understanding why is your body going to respond in these ways? Why is gluten a big problem for you? Why should we avoid certain foods? How should we properly do a reintroduction if you're histamine intolerant? And so it is very nuanced. And so sometimes the conventional disordered eating road, it's really not going to be the best route for somebody who's got something like mast cell or chronic inflammatory response syndrome. And then that can lead those cases, unfortunately, to just dismiss help in that area and struggle in silence and just try to get to the bottom of their symptoms. I want to emphasize that you've got to bring the emotional aspect into your healing journey for mycotoxin illness, because likely if you have experienced disordered eating or you've got an eating disorder, that is taking up a lot of your mental real estate. And that alone can mimic the pro-inflammatory cytokine storm that you get when you take a hit of mold, right? It's these stress hormones that are cascading down all of your catecholamines and creating this predominant state of fight or flight for you. So it's very important to, get a team together that is going to address both parts in equal and that are going to complement each other. Okay, so let's summarize some of the key clinical takeaways here, and then we're going to go into some questions. So summarizing the relationship between mycotoxins and disordered eating patterns. Number one, we've got mold and mycotoxins disrupt the HPA axis, right? So that creates that hormonal and stress response that imbalance and affect appetite and your mood. Two, we've got neuroinflammation from mold that impairs dopamine and oxytocin, increases anxiety, depression, and vulnerability to binging or restricting. Number three, we've got leptin resistance that can be contributed by mycotoxins driving up oxidative stress, creating inflammation on that cell wall so your cells can't hear the leptin. That can lead to overeating and for some cycle into loss of appetite. Number four, the mesolimbic reward system becomes dysregulated. So that makes food or the control of food your coping mechanism. Number five is chronic illness stress and feeling misunderstood. This can drive emotional eating or restrictive patterns to regain a sense of control. And then finally, therapeutic diets using chronic illness that can unintentionally foster restrictive eating patterns. They can be really helpful, but we have to watch out for this obsession, hypervigilance around eating correctly, okay? So as we are transitioning into questions here, I just want to remind you that you're not powerless if this is you. We can address both the body-brain mechanisms impacted by mycotoxins and the eating patterns. They can all soften naturally and flow into each other with the right approach to care. And so your support system should include some biological support, some emotional support, and absolutely nervous system-based support. Couple of things that are foundational that can be helpful. We talk about this in the article, so definitely go read more about why these things are helpful to disordered eating. One of my favorites from a biochemical standpoint is actually a Bach flower essence. It's crabapple. It is designed to accept imperfections, and so it can help kind of smooth out that perfectionism and soften any obsession or control around food. Microbalance Health has a few that I really love and recommend for some with this case presentation as well. The Microflora Mood and Mind Probiotic. This probiotic strain helps to lower oxidative stress. So ultimately those cells are going to hear your dopamine and your leptin a bit better. And that's important for your mood and appetite regulation. Phosphatidylcholine, this can help repair the cell membrane. Again, same idea. We're trying to create an increased sensitivity to leptin and to dopamine. Can also support liver function and bile flow. So if you are somebody who kind of wakes up with that morning nausea, this could be a good one as well. Microbalance Health Cell Tropin, that is a homeopathic designed to support the HPA axis, right? That main central system that connects the biochemical with the somato-emotional, can help calm your anxiety and your stress overload and desensitize you to mycotoxins. And then the Breathe Easy Kit. This is, you're probably going, why would you recommend a nasal rinse when it comes to disordered eating? And this is going back to the original conversation of that is the entry point, right? That's the entry point to inflaming the brain and creating neuroinflammation. And so we have to clear it out of the sinuses to really approach this the right way. So that's on biochemical support. On some emotional support, these are some of the things that I really like to recommend to my clients as an integrative doctor and emotional eating coach. I really like to encourage them to create a dopamine menu. Okay, so when we understand what's happening here, we can then start to go, okay, well, food or restriction doesn't have to be the only way that I receive this dopamine hit. Couple ideas can be grounding in nature, it could be calling a friend, it could be a hug with a dog or a family member, it could be music, a warm bath, something to create a list so that you can choose from. And I encourage people to look at that list when you're feeling the urge to binge or you're feeling the urge to restrict. No, okay, I'm going to create a pattern interrupt right now. I'm going to go to my dopamine menu and I know that I need the dopamine. So let me see how I actually want to receive that today. And some days it might be something off the list. It might be a walk outside. And then some days it actually might be going ahead and having the snack or whatever you were going to do to begin with. Okay, so knowing that there's flexibility there and that your body and your brain, they have choices to receive the need and that the need will get met is the most important thing to reinforce to your nervous system. One thing that I really like is a chocolate meditation because it integrates mindfulness and a high reward food. So I'll teach you how to do that. You're going to take just one small square of chocolate. It's kind of like a chocolate tasting, if you will, and you observe it, you smell it, you see how it looks, and then you put it on your tongue and you let it melt, no chewing. Okay, so you let it melt on your tongue and you get connected to how your body feels. Okay, so how's my body feeling as I'm letting this chocolate melt? And you're going to start to become aware of what it feels like to shift into dopamine and oxytocin with mindfulness, because the truth is actually that if you're seeking dopamine and oxytocin, food is really fulfilling that within the first few bites. And so if we can just bring a mindfulness component in, because scarcity is driving hurried eating when it comes to binge and emotional eating. Hurriedness and scarcity is driving that need to eat quickly and eat a lot. And we actually get all that we need biochemically within the first few bites. So having that chocolate meditation, that can be really helpful as a means to slow down if you are somebody that struggles with the binge eating component, and if you're somebody that struggles with restriction or anorexic type patterns, it can actually invite this pleasure aspect and celebratory aspect of food that you might be missing, because you're seeing food as numbers and food as calories when it actually needs to be celebration and pleasure and nourishment and energy and all of these different ways, right? It's all of the different roles that food can play, because it's multidimensional, it's nutritional, it's emotional, it's social, and it's cultural or spiritual, right? We are gathered around the table historically to celebrate or connect with others. And so again, just reinforcing that the problems arise when we overfocus on just one of those roles. True nourishment comes from balance. And so a couple questions you could reflect on would be, what role has been dominant and which role food has been neglected? Start by just something simple. Share a meal with somebody or cook a nourishing meal for yourself. When it comes to chronic illness and disordered eating, we're dealing with a lot of fear. We're dealing with body betrayal sometimes. We're dealing with loss of trust in the body. Those emotional patterns are very similar in both chronic illness and disordered eating. So it's natural that these things can cross over. If you are dealing with this, you've got a diagnosis, again, doing some psychotherapy with a qualified clinician can be really good. And so we are going to open it up to some questions now. We've got some really good ones, actually. Okay. Get a drink of water there. All right. So first question is, what are your thoughts on GLP-1 and microdosing? I'm seeing this all over my Facebook groups for mold toxicity. I feel like this is a slippery and dangerous slope. There's a lot of different thoughts on GLP-1 microdosing, right? I think most of us in the integrative space are all on the same page of like GLP-1s, regular dose, probably not the best road, right? There's one reason in particular that I'm not a huge fan of even microdosing the GLP-1 in a presentation like this. And it has to do with the fact that it delays gastric emptying. Okay, so a couple reasons for that. If you're histamine intolerant, having your food putrefy essentially in your stomach longer can increase the histamine load. So slowing down your gastric emptying, it's not really something that's ideal. And mycotoxins can slow bowel motility anyways. It can make you constipated. So I'm not a huge fan of that idea due to that food putrefaction. And then some people are just sensitive to certain types of substances, peptides, and methods of delivery that can provoke a mast cell flare in some people. So I would generally say that that's probably not the ideal way to manage it. Yes, it might be a Band-Aid, but ultimately it's just a Band-Aid, and those patterns are going to come around until you address the root cause. Okay. Does mold illness show up as an eating disorder for teens, and how can we help them? Yeah, absolutely. So mold illness can definitely look like an eating disorder for teenagers, especially girls, because there are a lot of there's a hormonal orchestra going on. And so as the hormones start to change, we've got an increased susceptibility to histamine issues and biotoxin related illness. And then also, in that time in life, you're starting to become more aware of how you look and your body image. You're dealing with more complex issues emotionally and socially, maybe with friendships. And so food can be one of the ways to cope with that if they don't have the tools in their toolbox to regulate and ground themselves. And so I definitely would go back to some of the exercises we talked about before with the dopamine menu and making sure that there is some sort of emotional digestion tool, right, in their toolbox, to use the food analogy. Some sort of emotional digestion tool needs to be at play, and then dealing with the root cause. If you do suspect that it's a mold issue, doing some kind of very gentle detox can be good. And then homeopathics can be a really gentle way to go about recalibrating the body on a biochemical and emotional level as well. So I would look at some of those, but ultimately I would work with somebody one-on-one if you are hitting roadblocks. And it's hard for as parents to, I work with a lot of families, and it's hard for the parent to step in, especially on an issue like disordered eating, because we don't want it to feel disciplinarian and create any more guilt or shame around it. But you love your kids and you want to make sure that they're the healthiest, happiest version that they can be. So I would definitely extend that love and that grace by giving them access, and if you can, resources to work with somebody who can gently walk them through that. Okay, are there any studies showing those with eating disorders are more likely to be living in moldy homes? Okay, so there are no direct studies. Remembering that, like in research, right, correlation is not causation. And so we are looking primarily, especially in the creation of this article, we're looking at the literature that is published on mood disorders and mycotoxins and neuroinflammation, and then the biochemical and hormonal cascade that is the fallout of an inflamed brain and mycotoxin illness. So I don't think that there has been a study funded on that, but I think it would be very interesting. So, it's still mycotoxin, literature on mycotoxins is still a fairly emerging field that we have some gaps in the literature on. And so this would definitely be an area that I think would be a really cool study. So I hope to see it in the future. Okay. How does mold cause leptin resistance? I think we covered this one in the conversation, but again, going back to that inflamed cell and the cell's inability to hear the leptin. That is the biggest thing due to the oxidative stress that mycotoxins create. So again, this is kind of the correlation in versus causation, right? Mycotoxins, I don't want to say mycotoxins cause leptin resistance. It's more like mycotoxins create the condition for the cell to not be able to hear your leptin. And so it's the oxidative stress, it's the cell inflammation, but we know for certain that mold drives up oxidative stress. I hope that makes sense. So there are specific type of eating or disordered eating more commonly seen with mold toxicity, i.e. binge purge restriction combo. I've seen both in practice. I see combo a lot, and then I would be more inclined to saying this is purely an observational data. I think that I would tend to see binge more, just because there is a need for the dopamine hit, and that can be sometimes the only pleasure seeking behavior that we have access to when we're really sick. And then orthorexia is a big one too. So is the mold toxicity why someone would vary from not feeling hungry at times to feeling like they're still hungry even after eating? Yeah, this can be connected and tied back to that leptin resistance conversation where, what I started to notice, and I'll just kind of give you the my perspective as somebody who's gone through the eating disorders and mycotoxins, I started to notice that whenever I would have a symptom flare, my disordered eating patterns would become worse. And part of that is the stress and dealing with the symptom flare, right? The coping aspect. And part of that is when you have a symptom flare, your oxidative stress is higher, your cells can't hear the leptin as well. And so it's a both and type of a situation. And then like I said before, if you are having a really high stress on the liver gallbladder, a lot of times you can feel unappetized. And so there's different presentations to that, but certainly mold can be a contributing factor of why you feel like your hunger cues are on a little bit of a roller coaster. All right. Do we have any more questions? Happen in the chat. Okay. I did that for years. I reached for food to give an easy, simple, enjoyable, pleasant moment in my day. It was a positive moment while I was struggling daily with mold illness and mast cell. Yeah, 100%. It can feel like the only means of pleasure that you have, and then throw a therapeutic diet on top of it, and it's going to drive the restrictive scarcity mindset even more and create even more fear and compulsive behavior around food and or restricting food. Absolutely. Could you address the fungal aspect of mold illness and how someone might have SIFO and what can be done to get rid of it? Yeah, absolutely. So the fungal overgrowth, so SIFO, small intestinal fungal overload, a lot of times folks are diagnosed with SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. What I tend to notice is from a root cause perspective, typically those who develop SIBO or SIFO, they have this overpopulation of candida in the gut, that naturally occurring gut fungus, and or a high load of mycotoxins that are, it's essentially crowding out your gut flora's, your good bacteria's ability to regulate the ecosystem and the microbiome of the gut. And so then we've got all these bacterial strains that are getting out of whack, the candida is getting out of whack, and we've got sludgy mycotoxin buildup in the intestines. This is another thing going back to kind of that slowed bowel motility and some constipation that can happen there. So I'm not sure if there's anything specific that you wanted to know in terms of, fungus and SIFO, but essentially fungus is that cause to SIFO. What could address the fungal aspect of mold illness? Ooh, could we pop that one back in one more time? Perfect, thank you. And how might someone have SIFO? What can you do? Okay, what can you do to get rid of it? Yeah, absolutely. So you want to be on a one-on-one individualized protocol, right? Your body's going to have its own set of priorities and its own preferences as far as antifungal goes. Couple good ones that are generally speaking, that can be beneficial for that. I really like olive leaf, and I really like rosemary. And so those can be two antifungal herbs that are really good. I also think that binders are really important. One of my favorites for SIFO presentation is smilax or sarsaparilla root. That's specifically a mycotoxin gut binder. And then of course, other binders Microbalance Health has a great binder. There's also some great ones in Supreme Nutrition, or again, Smilax Supreme is one, and then Takasumi Supreme. Cellcore has great binders as well. So we definitely want to prioritize binding. And then I would temporarily kind of go on to this anti-inflammatory. We don't want to feed the body things that are going to automatically colonize and putrefy in that SIBO-CIFO presentation. So I would be mindful of aggravating factors there as far as food sensitivities and nutritional aspects go without being overly restrictive. So antifungals, binders, you have to determine is this just SIFO? Is this isolated to your gut? Did it come in because you were on a round of antibiotics, or because you were eating foods that were highly contaminated with mycotoxins for a long time? Or is this beyond your gut and is it a whole body systemic issue? Because that is more than likely the case. And so in that case, what else do you need to do to address? You need to work on the HPA axis. You need to target sinus care. So making sure that you have all your bases covered there and knowing, is the fungus just impacting my small intestine, or is it more systemic, which is more likely than not? What about uncontrolled weight gain from mold exposure? I'm counting macros and they haven't changed. Yeah, this is really hard. So we were talking a little bit about insulin resistance before. Mold is also an obesogen, right? So it kind of inflames the cell, creates this inflammation, and you could be doing all the right things to lose weight and you're actually gaining weight, the scale's going up. Those of you with mast cell, if you've got a histamine flush, like 5 pounds can go on overnight. It's really difficult mentally to navigate that. I think that this is where the big challenge of self-compassion comes in, right? Because you can only do what you can do and what you can control. And if you're healing and the weight keeps going up despite your efforts, at some point your efforts need to be targeted towards nervous system regulation and self-compassion, because the more you stress about it, the more you're going to throw those stress hormones for a loop. I think that making sure that your thyroid's properly supported is a really big one, right? Your thyroid gland is right underneath of your sinuses. And so what happens when you have a lot of gunk in your sinuses, you get postnasal drip. And then sometimes your lymph nodes become inflamed around your neck, and your thyroid is sitting right in the middle of that chaos. Your thyroid is also supported by your pituitary gland, right? We talked about that at the beginning, how those vapors are going up. So the pituitary gland is releasing thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, and signaling your thyroid to produce T4, which converts into T3, right? So when you have the mold exposure going on and you're breathing it in all the time, the thyroid is the canary in the coal mine, and it's going to contribute to that weight gain that we see in a lot of mold cases. So definitely properly supporting your thyroid. Thyroid glandulars can be great. Nasal rinsing, gargling with potentially some, like a drop of eucalyptus oil and some distilled water and some salt. And then, some people require bioidenticals if your thyroid's really, really low. I don't prescribe those with an integrated medicine, but sometimes I do have clients and patients who come in that are on those or are required to kind of go out and do some bioidentical just to give the thyroid the boost that they need to recover, because that is your master energy gland. So that's a really important thing to look at. Make sure that if you are you're exploring that you get a full thyroid panel, not just TSH and T4. You want to see the free T3. You want to see the reverse T3. You want to see if your thyroid has any antibodies, because mycotoxin illness is one of the primary things that I see in conditions like Hashimoto's. What are your thoughts on BPC 157 for mycotoxins? I like this. I like BPC 157. This is a peptide that is anti-inflammatory to the gut, for those of you who are not familiar with it. It can be really good at supporting the gut and supporting the MSH, which is often suppressed in CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. I do think that peptides, BPC 157, VIP, some of these are better on the back end of a protocol to recover from mold. I don't usually see these tests for patients as a first line of defense. We usually have to go, eliminate first, clean up the air, clean up the body. Some antifungals are probably needed, some targeted sinus care. Then we get into rebuilding and desensitizing. When it comes to the rebuilding and desensitizing, I do see BPC 157 be really beneficial. So everybody's a little bit different, but I've seen a lot of people do well with that one. Thoughts on vibration plates for mycotoxin illness since I can't exercise quite yet? Yeah, I absolutely love that idea. It's a great way to get your lymph moving. I would give you here's a fun tip for you. We usually just use the vibration plate on our feet, right? Something that's really good if you have sinus issues and mold illness and you're trying to work on your upper lymphatic chain, you've got maybe a puffy neck, again, the thyroid issues, going back to that, roll a towel underneath or grab a yoga mat, and put it under your knees. And then you will put your hands on the vibration plate and kind of brace that outer arm like you were to do a push-up. And you'll let that vibration go on your upper lymphatic chain, which is going to help loosen up any congestion and mucus in that upper lymphatic chain. So yes to vibration plate. What nervous system retraining program do you recommend? Okay, I'll shameless plug. I have one. I have a membership called Renew. That's a brain retraining course. So you get a course and you get a community. We do some live calls, and then I do brain retraining one-on-one with patients using a technique called parts and memory therapy. It's a form of limbic brain retraining. There's also really good ones like Annie Hopper's DNRS. EMDR can be good for some. It's less of a limbic system program, but it's more, kind of teasing out the different parts and the root causes. And then Primal Trust is also a really great one. Gupta is awesome as well, but if you're a type A, it can be a little bit intense. So just keep that in mind. How do we unflip the gene switch that was triggered by mold? Yeah, so I'm assuming you might be referring to the HLA-DR gene mutation, and a really big one to switching it off is to avoid exposure for a short period of time and go through a process of desensitization. You can't really desensitize if you have not removed the exposure and avoided it for a short time. Typically about 3 months is where you want to be exposure free as much as possible, right? Sometimes we have to go to the grocery store, we have to, go out to dinner and we get a hit. But as much as we can to avoid a constant exposure for about 3 months, we've got to support the genetic expression by lowering that oxidative stress and inflammation and giving the body a chance to relearn to behave and respond at a less drastic or a less inflammatory manner when you are exposed to mold the next time. If living in a moldy environment and can't get out, is it dangerous to stay on herbs a long time? It's not dangerous to stay on herbs a long time. You do need to rotate your herbs around. It's kind of like taking the same antibiotic for a long time. You get resistant. Same thing with like probiotics. You want to rotate those around, right? You don't want to stay on the same collection of herbs forever. You do want to rotate, just like diet variation. Your herbs are your nutrition as well. So you want to make sure you're rotating those. I always think that doing something is better than doing nothing. I do have some patients that can't get out of their home right away, and we need to make it the best that it possibly can be. And so I do definitely think supporting, I really strongly prioritize supporting methylation pathways, getting them good quality binders, targeted sinus care, and then air quality support, and then whatever antifungals may test for them to manage their symptoms in the mold. But definitely take your priority to making the air quality the best it possibly can be. And Microbalance Health has some incredible products to do that. My ED is mold related. Will it get better in a better environment? This is a short answer. It can, yes. So again, we're talking about eating disorders. It's kind of a little bit of a sensitive and a dicey topic, right? But think about the inflammation of the brain. Again, your brain being on fire in the moldy environment. Right away, as we shift you into a better environment, the fire in the brain is going to start to reduce. You're going to have less neuroinflammation. You're going to have a little less anxiety. You're going to have a little less depression. You're going to have a little bit less compulsion and coping needed to heal your dopamine. And so that's one part. And then the other part is actually dealing with any underlying emotional stressors underneath, and or the trauma of being sick in living in a moldy house. That's got to be addressed as the next step. So yes, it definitely can. Okay, I don't know if we have any more questions. Oh, there we go. Thoughts on adrenal support to help with eating disorders? Yeah, I think adrenal support is really important. I focus kind of more on the HPA axis within that chain. So to me, that's doing some things that are going to support the pituitary gland. You're going to clear the sinuses out. You're going to support the thyroid. You're going to give the adrenals some support since you're constantly on that nervous system fight or flight. Couple of things that I really like for this. Again, Celtropin by Microbalance Health is great. And I really like Microbalance Health's Adrenal Boost supplement. It's got some really great things, including Schisandra in it, which is an anxiolytic herb. That's an herb that helps tame anxiety. Schisandra also opens up all the detox pathways of your liver. So it's kind of a double dip. So that could be a really nice thing as well. And then some patients of mine do really well with pituitary glandulars as well to support the HPA axis. Do you work virtually with clients? Yes, I do. So if you've not, and I totally forgot to do this at the beginning, I work in Greenville, South Carolina, functional medicine doctor in Greenville, South Carolina. We're in the upstate. We're about an hour and 15 from Asheville, North Carolina. I work with patients in person. And then I work with clients virtually via a DNA hair sample. So we do a very targeted, specific type of non-invasive testing in the office that is targeted to address the root cause and detect the root cause, kind of get you answers and solutions faster. We also do immersion types of treatments for out-of-towners who want to come in person, but 100% I work with virtual clients. But methylation issues are challenging for detox with the MTHFR gene 2, vibration plates, red light therapies, amethyst mats, nutrition is all on point, all clean, etc. Nothing seems to help. Absolutely, yeah. The MTHFR gene mutation, this is another one. Mycotoxins impair methylation, right? So they make it harder for you to methylate. I do think that if you've not already gone down this road doing an oats test or doing like a 3x4 genetics test, this has been really helpful for some of my patients that hit sticking points, so that we can see exactly what pathways are impacted in order to get the methylation up and going again. Because sometimes that generic methylation support's not quite enough. If you haven't tested it and you're just kind of guessing, you're doing some methylated Bs or you're doing some molybdenum, really knowing what part of the methylation is thrown off and genetically expressing a little bit sideways can be extremely helpful at symptom improvement. Okay, guys, any more questions for us today? That's it. Okay. Well, again, I'm Dr. Krista. I'm with Somasandra Wellness in Greenville, South Carolina, integrative and functional medicine, nervous system focused, and focus on brain retraining. I specialize in mycotoxin illness and other complex conditions like Lyme disease and autoimmunity. And I would love to have a conversation with you if you want to work together. And we're popping some of those links to read more about this topic in the article on sinusitiswellness.com. And if you guys have any follow-up questions, I love to chat with you. So thank you so much for watching today. Again, this was educational purposes. Thank you for all your questions. They were fantastic and excited to connect and see you on the next one. Bye, everybody.